apologize for not being here this morning. I've been told it was very exciting. And therefore there will be more excitement this afternoon. We start on discussing the issues about citizenship and sovereignty, and particularly on the chapter Twilight of Sovereignty or the Emergence of Cosmopolitan Norms, Rethinking Citizenship in Volatile Times. And Richard Bellamy will start the introduction with a quarter of an hour or so, and then Seyla will reply, and then, as I've been told, we'll have another half hour for discussion. And so let's start.
Okay, well, thanks very much. So in time-honoured fashion, I'll start by summarising those bits of the chapter that I'm going to concentrate on, and then give my commentary upon them. I should say, I think that this is a rich chapter, and in part it reveals, and I think this will be sort of crucial to what I say, an interplay between the empirical and the normative. And so, in part, I think what I will be disputing is not so much the normative case, though there are elements of that, as the empirical case. As Seyla notes in the opening paragraph of this essay, it addresses one of the key themes of her work in recent decades, the disaggregation of citizenship rights across different national and international regimes. In its classic T.H. Marshall form, citizenship involved what Marshall called full membership of the national political community. And so conceived, citizenship was a package of civil, political, and social rights that derived from belonging and contributing to the national culture and economy of a sovereign state. And each of these elements complemented each other in ways I'll discuss in a moment. Now, Seyla argues that migration and globalisation, on the one hand, and the development of international human rights regimes and forms of global governance, on the other, have dramatically altered this situation. Not only do many people now enjoy dual citizenship, but there are increasing numbers of denizens and aliens who have access to civil and social rights, and even certain political rights, without naturalising as citizens or assuming nationality. Such moves have been facilitated by international human rights regimes, such as the United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees, which create obligations on states to offer a Kantian right to hospitality, one of Seyla's other key themes of her earlier work, to persons fearing persecution in their state of origin or nationality. Within the EU, which in some sense is a kind of exemplar of some of these developments, we've even seen the development of a transnational status of citizenship that facilitates the freedom of movement of citizens between member states by preventing discrimination on the basis of nationality, but also of gender, ethnicity, or religion in their exercise of the economic, civil, social, and political rights that membership of the EU obliges all contracting states to offer to the citizens of other member states who reside in or trade with them. Now, that last rather awkward specification, I think, is important because in ways which I'll talk about towards the end of this presentation, to my mind, it captures both the strengths and potential weaknesses of Seyla's argument. EU citizenship and the rights it confers aren't provided directly by the EU itself. Rather, they offer access to certain entitlements provided by each of the member states. It's not so much that the EU itself has taken on a certain of the trappings of a sovereign state, as that it represents an instance, perhaps the only or certainly the most developed instance, of what Seyla calls a republican federation of states, in which each member state has modified its sovereign claims vis-à-vis the other member states. Now, in general terms, I have a lot of sympathy for this argument. But I think that Seyla's version of Republican federalism takes the disaggregation of citizenship and the weakening of state sovereignty further than has actually occurred, at least within the EU, and further than it's necessary or in some ways desirable if popular sovereignty, which, as we saw from earlier sessions, has a certain place in her thinking, is to continue to have any force. So, again, I'm much in sympathy with Seyla's belief that popular sovereignty has to remain salient. As she says, it forms an essential part of the right to have rights, the means through which citizens reinterpret rights through numerous democratic iterations, which shape, control them to serve their interests. What I'm less convinced by is that popular sovereignty can survive the disaggregation of citizenship rights and the twilight of sovereignty that she proposes. So Seyla's argument advances sort of in a dialectical fashion, in a way, as a way of countering or engaging with three alternative readings of global politics within this chapter. One is global capitalism and the development of a global lex mercatoria. Another is the view of globalisation as an imperial project of a hegemonic empire, as theorised by Antonio Negri and Michael Hart. And the third are theories of global governance, such as that of Anne-Marie Slaughter and of David Held. And she wants to counterpose her version of cosmopolitanism founded in discourse ethics to all three of these. But I think she also, because it's like a dialectic that you engage in, takes certain elements of these three, and it's the elements that she takes which are part of my disagreement, because I think each of them exaggerates certain empirical claims. So the first, global capitalism argument, exaggerates the degree to which the world economy is globalised and the degree to which global capitalism promotes a race to the bottom. For example, multinational production is barely 10% of the world's most integrated economies, and public spending as a percentage of GDP in those economies which are most open to inward investment has actually risen. And that's a rise, even if you take independently the rise in public spending of most developed economies due to increase in pension payments. We're all getting older, I regret to say. Second, the empire argument, and actually Seyla herself says this, exaggerates the degree to which global capital has created a global civil society able to foster a counterforce to empire. But although she says it, I think she relies in part on that argument. And then third, the global governance argument exaggerates the degree to which international law and regulation reflects cosmopolitan norms that constrain state sovereignty in positive ways. I don't want to deny that some of the ways are positive, but I think that very often these norms are captured by the very hegemonic political and economic powers that they're supposed to constrain. Now, while I think Seyla shares some of these criticisms, her own argument assumes a weaker version of each of these exaggerated claims. I also think she underestimates the degree to which her own insistence on popular sovereignty as a mechanism for the democratic entrenchment of rights by providing what she calls an enduring form of democratic control requires the continuing context of sovereign state power and a related citizenship that her theory of the disaggregation of citizenship rights undermines. In other words, the argument Seyla takes from these three schools weaken the positive argument that she wants to make against them. Take the issue of social rights. The importance here of democratic iteration is evident in the fact that international or domestic constitutionalization of such rights appears to have little or no impact on their implementation per se. The key factor are the level of development of the country concerned, and crucially for our discussion today, the ability of the underprivileged to organise themselves in unions and parties so as to promote their interests. But the effectiveness of such organisations depend themselves on some enduring form of popular sovereignty in which the possession of citizenship as a package has an important role. In particular, citizens must have a long-term and roughly equal stake in collective decisions so as to avoid incentives for free riding. You need cross-cutting cleavages that avoid the possibility of discrete and isolated consistent minorities, which could include the poor. And you need a shared public sphere that diminishes the possibilities for rent-seeking and or the playing off of different groups by elites. These conditions are reasonably, not perfectly, well met in most democratic nation states. And those which are exceptions to this rule tend to emphasise the importance of having these conditions in the first place. So countries, for example, which where you don't have cross-cutting cleavages, or rather those are less important than vertical segmental cleavages, those tend to be ones where transfers from richer segments, such as the Flemish in Belgium, to the poorer segments, like the French, are highly disputed and difficult to agree to. Similar problems can happen in deeply class-divided societies where you have a fragmented political system which creates veto points which enable the privileged to hold on to their privileges and not redistribute to the poor. Prime example of that is the United States, probably the most counter-majoritarian system of any nation state, but also and one with very deep and deepening class divisions within it, which are hard to overcome. But I think the disaggregation of citizenship, and with it of political sovereignty, undercuts the working of popular sovereignty, which requires that kind of unified political system. Citizens with social rights, but no duty of economic contribution or political participation, can basically free ride, weakening in the process the capacity of domestic labour unions and parties to promote such rights. That's what arguably has happened in the EU, where the Court of Justice of the European Union, in decisions like Viking and Laval, has allowed the undercutting of nationally negotiated labour rates to be undercut by it's called the Posted Workers Directive, and it's whereby you can bring with you, if you're a foreign company, people from your own country and pay them the rates that they'd get in Romania in Sweden, basically. So that means that you're then lowering the rate for people. Cases like Schwarz and Watts are cases where things like education and health, which were regarded as public services, which were not to be commodifiable in the same way as other services, the cause has now sort of said, okay, so if I'm a British person and my health authority is limiting my access to a certain kind of treatment in order to control the health service bill, if I can get that treatment in another member state, I can go there, but the UK still has to pay for it. But then that undermines the fiscal integrity of the UK and its capacity to balance its budget. So it becomes a certain kind of free riding. So one of the problems is that the human right discourse can be ones which actually reinforce rather than counteract the lex mercatoria, and I think that that's precisely what's happened in this sort of case. Now, one might think, well, surely within the EU you could counterbalance this through what Seyla calls the cross-border interlocking and coordination of democratic iterations. She talks about how you can get women's movements, ecology movements, mobilized by international human rights mechanisms. And through that, they can act as a voice which can deal with these issues and provide common cause amongst groups across the EU in this case, or the world even. But I think that this is rather like the empire theorist's politics of the multitude that you deride. I mean, again, the EU is a very good example because here the Commission has tried to establish what it calls umbrella organisations which precisely coordinate different civil society organisations in this way and give them a transnational voice. But what you discover is that these organisations are basically organisations funded by the EU. They don't have groups that genuinely feed into them because those groups at the national level haven't been particularly Europeanised and they fight different battles. Moreover, those organisations themselves can't operate as very effective proxy organisations because they're not particularly, they don't have democratic legitimacy. So how can they be organs of democratic iteration? The mass member organisations, well, in the UK, they are the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, the Automobile Association, and the National Trust. They're all sort of service organisations for middle-class people who like to go and see birds, visit aristocratic homes, and get their cars towed home. they're not organisations which mobilise people in public interest strategies across dimensions. So, to the extent, I mean, that the EU does reflect popular sovereignty, as you describe it, namely as the interlocking in global, local and national public spheres of the many process of democratic iteration in which peoples learn from one another. It's through being territorialised forms of state power. In other words, it happens because it operates as a federation of democratic states, which effectively brings those demoi together. And I would say that the only way in which one can overcome the problems of of make citizenship effective is if you have popular sovereignty related to some form of state sovereignty, whether you put it at the European level or at the member state level, or regard the states as being proxies for their peoples. So, well, I have other things I could say, but I think I'll stop there.
I know that you come fresh from this comment, so you don't get improvised, but the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for everything that you've done for this conference as well. And I was very gentle on the EU in the concluding paragraphs in this essay, let me take a few steps back, because I really did not say enough about the EU here and its internal problems of organizational configuration, other than just pointing to it as a successful example of the reassembling of the markers of sovereignty. But the issues that you are raising go much deeper and beyond this. I think there are two sets of issues. Part of it is, as you say, about the empirics, about how we assess these transformations. The other is the tangled up question of the relationship of popular sovereignty to some form of state sovereignty, and at the end you left it hypothetical yourself, so we could come back to that. Now, about the first set of issues, this phenomenon of disaggregation is, I believe, global. Although at the time that I finished writing this chapter, I was following more on the work that I had done on the EU and the rights of others. And what I understand by the disaggregation of citizenship rights is the following. Because of the changing patterns of migration, and because of the changing patterns of economic mobility, what we now have is the phenomenon, and not just in Europe, worldwide. I'll give you some examples. We have the phenomenon of individuals now who are citizens of one country and living in some degree of membership relationship to the host country. I mean, 19th century migrations assumed, the kind of naturalization of the migrant. This is not happening for all sorts of reasons that we know about. Now, the disaggregation has the consequence that the individual who is a long-term resident of another society is usually entitled to a set of human as well as civil rights. The EU is different, of course, because in the EU, because of the emergence of EU citizenship with Maastricht, you also have a bundle of political rights, and you have contested socio-economic rights. But in many other countries of the world as well, the increasing protections provided to migrants by the international human rights regime is coming along with some form also of socio-economic and maybe even cultural rights. What would be some examples of this? Take the dynamic economies of the Middle East. For example, the countries in the Gulf region are now becoming, one of the largest areas in the world where there are migrant workers. And of course, because of the undemocratic nature of many of these regimes, both the human as well as the civil and political rights of these migrants are extremely contested. But take a case that is less known, a country like Israel, with 700,000 migrants. Some of them now are second generation from Vietnam, from China, from Romania, from Bulgaria, from Central America, who are now really basically, forcing the question of the definition of citizenship. And these individuals are entitled to the full palette of civil and human rights, plus some degree of socio-economic rights and elementary school rights. And then there are examples of Latin America and Spain. And the most interesting example, though, this is really very closely related to the emergence of a kind of global elite, is the case of Asian countries like Hong Kong, Singapore, even Malaysia, and multiple citizenships. There are studies on this. So I think that this process is really quite global, and there is more empirical evidence that I could bring into this chapter. But your argument about disaggregation is also a normative one. I think that ultimately what you're saying is that disaggregation of citizenship rights is weakening citizenship, right? That is, if we see the core of citizenship not just residency and being entitled to socio-economic rights, but also as some kind of, you have a civic republican understanding, some of which I share, maybe not as strictly as yours. You're concerned about this. I don't see it that way all the way. And let me explain why. Because I think that actually long-term migrants are emerging as crucial activist groups all over the world. They are engaging in practicing more of the virtues of civic republican citizenship than you would think. I think this is true for many Turkish groups in Germany. They have both right and left-wing political activism, but they are politically active. They're not just consumers. It is true, certainly, for the very large Latino community in the United States, and not just around their citizenship rights. It was true for the huge Latin American community of refugees and exiles in Spain for many years. So there is some relationship between the kind of the traditional virtues of activist citizenship and the migrants. I mean, I'm really so this is why I'm careful to use the term political membership, because there are gradations of political membership and ways of engaging it. I mean, you can be a political agent without being a citizen, just as you can be no political agent, except you don't even need to vote once you are a citizen. So I think we may have some disagreement about the degree to which the process of disaggregation is undermining classical civic republican virtues. That's why I don't quite see the juxtaposition of popular sovereignty and the disaggregation of citizenship rights in the following way. If the core of popular sovereignty is that those who are subject to the law also consider themselves, in some sense, its authors, and in some senses, of course, where we all have to worry about what's in. Then the disaggregation of citizenship rights that extends voice to those who are subject to the law is, in fact, a fundamental democratic principle, and it, in fact, helps popular sovereignty. I mean, the very concrete discussion concerning this would be the question of local and regional voting rights, right? I mean, this was a big discussion within the EU before everything became markets. I mean, the whole political discussion in the EU has now just been forgotten, right? But this was a question, why not grant for third country nationals? What justification is there for not granting someone who has made the kinds of commitments that you are talking about to a residency? And there has to be some minimum residency requirements, etc. And this is a matter of democratic voice and democratic participation, expanding the franchise. And so from a theoretical standpoint, it seems to me that popular sovereignty is not really undermined by these measures, and they can even lead you to a kind of revitalization of activism, which we do see in many communities. Now, final point again, I'm sorry to be, these are so provocative, but we have to leave room for the questions and for the conversation. I don't know if, we seem to be, look, at the time that, I finished this chapter, and I don't think that the extent of the economic crisis within the EU and its consequences for the political architecture of the way was really clear. I think it's sort of hit maybe many of us, I mean, certainly myself. But nevertheless, we have to understand for ourselves more clearly the degree to which we are saying popular sovereignty is bound up with the fate of the nation state. I think this is the argument, and I'm not quite sure whether you're making it or whether you're saying that the evidence that I'm giving that it need not be that is not quite sufficient, because I mean, we know that democracy and the nation state had a somewhat of a successful marriage for a while, but we also know that popular sovereignty had its origins in different formations, in the city-state form. What exactly is the argument we are making there? If the argument is an argument about territoriality as being a principle of representation, let's say a better principle of representation than what Otto Bauer thought, right? In there were schemes, at the time that European socialists supported, that people should be represented in terms of their nationality, not in terms of their territoriality. Yeah, it was one of the principles. I happen to believe that was a terrible idea, and I like the principle of territorial representation, because I think that territoriality is, I believe, a more neutral, a more open, and there's, I think it's more compatible with individual autonomy, but territoriality and the nation are not overlapping categories necessarily, are they? They very rarely have been.
No.
And so, I mean, those who, maybe someone who is more of a communitarian than yourself would make this argument in terms of the principle of solidarity. They would say, look, when the chips are down, national egotisms manifest themselves, the Germans against the Greeks and the Cypriots, sort of the Brits against, the European Central Bank, and, but I find that that is a theory about the eternal presence of national egotisms, and so I just don't know if it is even empirically correct. So my challenge to you would be to draw you out a little bit on where is the link between popular sovereignty and the state formation? Is it the principle of territoriality, which can be reconfigured, bigger or smaller, and there may be a size beyond which we cannot go? Or is it that territoriality is becoming a stand-in for the nation? And if so, at what level? These are some of the big questions, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. And so I would like to open now the discussion, questions or interventions. And I can also allow people who want to follow a question, if they raise both hands, that you say, I want to follow that question, to get in. But no, we have only got 20 minutes, 25 minutes, otherwise the next session will be delayed. The floor is open. Okay.
Building up on Richard's question, I wanted to ask you about one effect of popular sovereignty and the introduction of these illiberal measures, illiberal access to citizenship, such as citizenship first, but not only to citizenship, to residence as well, and this increasing, which comes from a desire of the majority to introduce and make more restrictive, more exclusive the entry to membership. How do you, and this is happening in the most advanced democracies that we know. What do you think about that? Is this a perverse effect of democracy, of popular sovereignty? This is my first question. The second has to do with this accumulation of rights. Is nationality one of the necessary rights, or can other rights compensate? Whether in a polity, if migrants and per country national, in addition to European citizens, will acquire the right to vote, would that be enough? Because you seem to argue, and they have equality of rights in other areas, because you seem to argue in the rest of the book that human rights rely on recognition. Will these migrants, will these foreigners, if
when discussing this question, is that these kinds of questions of citizenship, migration, and belonging, I think it's very important not to just be affected by the politics of the day. What I mean by this is this. Particularly within the European context, let me just contextualize this because I'm a political thinker, I'm an engaged thinker, I'm not just doing ex cathedra here. In times of economic crisis, you have a very conservative argument. And it's a conservative argument that to some extent also belies, flies in the face of facts. Because given, Europe's demographic needs, given, labor market mobility and so on, the question is not migrants, yes or no. The question at the back of politicians that they never talk about is which kind of migrants, right? Which kind of migrants? What's we're talking about? So that is, I think, a little bit the hidden agenda of the discussion that is never being quite, explained properly. And to some extent now also within the United States. But in terms of the concept of, popular sovereignty, there is a paradox that I have been working on for many, many years, and I think that last session Saladin also raised this, and it's called the paradox of democratic belonging. The first to formulate this was Robert Dahl. That is, in any democracy, those who are members at point T0, okay, have the privilege of determining those who will be members at point T1. And yet, those who are members at T0 have not been democratically circumscribed, elected, etc. So we're always in the midst of this paradox that the so-called democratic popular sovereign determines the conditions of its future membership, whereas the conditions of its future, of its own current membership cannot be subject to the same kind of democratic articulation, etc. The only way to deal with this, paradox, as a logical thing, is in terms of, recursivity. Yes, at T0, the boundaries are defined at a certain place. At T1, there is an iterative articulation. At T2, there is another iterative articulation. Just now thinking theoretically, without simply the politics, of migration. But right now, the politics of migration is really taking place within and under the constraints of a transnational discourse. All right? What I mean by this? You cannot denaturalize individuals. Right? There is a right not to be denaturalized. But is there a right to be naturalized? No, there isn't. And one of the works that I do as a constructive political philosopher, since my work in the rights of others, I'm trying to argue for a human right to citizenship, not that everybody should become citizens everywhere, that doesn't go that, but that it is immoral and illegitimate of a state to perpetually deny citizenship to outsiders under conditions that have not been specified and that I don't think can ever be quite fulfilled. As long as we live with sovereign entities, and as long as one is not claiming for a world without borders, which I'm not, because I don't think that world without borders is compatible with democracy, we are going to have to deal with the paradoxes that there will be clashes between the universalist claims of rights, of human rights, and the claims of the demos. The question is how to mediate them and how to find solutions that are legitimate as well as just. Certain kinds of language tests strike me as being plausible. Was the way in which language tests were being instituted in Bavaria, where foreigners were being asked to pass examinations that possibly, German school graduate himself or herself would have difficulty? No. Was it fair, to base immigration decisions during Margaret Thatcher's time by giving Muslim women virginity tests? No. That is against human dignity, right? So when we start thinking about these, the question then becomes a kind of, mediation of what justice demands and what is legitimately democratically possible. I mean, in the United States right now, we've neglected this question of migrants. We have 10 million undocumented migrants, and the political parties still can't figure out, in the largest, immigrant country in the world, what would be the correct procedures for citizenship and legalization. But it's going to happen. And why is it happening? Another interesting point, because they realized, that is the Republican Party, that the Latin vote is an organized vote and it matters. Now, from my point of view, this is a brilliant example of a case of democratic iteration. You see, because those who are already within the demos can themselves become spokespersons or advocates for those who are either in the demos but not full members, or who are outside the demos. And there is the politics of kinship, there is the politics of language, there is the politics of ethnicity. So the demos can change its own criteria of membership by these kinds of iterative processes, but there is no guarantee. There is no guarantee. So in that sense, since the popular sovereign can be illegitimate and unjust and stupid. So that's what I always said. We go back to Bonnie Honig. Yes, there can be juris pathos. Your final question, sorry if I go on and on about this. This gets me very, very worked up. The question of recognition and the rights of third country nationals, obviously recognition also involves, some forms of recognition involve a thicker form of moral acknowledgement. Not just recognition, but also acknowledgement, right? And that clearly is not simply something that comes as a result of formal membership status. That has to do with problems of cultural understanding and misunderstanding. And I think education and developing a common language, and is very important there. Okay?
Yeah, so a question of clarification that picks on one of the things you said in response to the question just asked, and goes back to something you mentioned earlier in the day. So at the beginning of the day, I remember you referring to the all affected interest principle as a way of identifying who has an entitlement to taking part in the democratic iterations, so to speak. And in your response to the lady over there, you invoked democratic iterations themselves as the mechanism through which we get to a view about who should be part of the demos, who should be included. And so I was wondering how these two principles, and I remember you said that there's problems with the all-affected interest principle. We can talk about it later if you like, and so I guess I'm taking the opportunity now.
Later.
This is later. And see how you mediate between these two, so to speak. Is this part of a mediation between democratic iterations on the one hand and justice on the other, represented by the all-affected interest principle? That's what we should ideally want. That's the demos that we would ideally want, but on the other hand, the principle by which we constitute the demos should itself be democratically validated, and so how do we mediate between these two?
Yes, indeed. Okay. All I want to say right now about the all-affected interest, because it would take a whole other conference, is there is some misunderstanding about this term. Robert Goodin is interpreting all-affected interest principle in terms of a utilitarian understanding of the term interest. Mm-hmm. When we use this in discourse theory, I think this was a problem in some formulations. Sometimes in discourse theory, it's alle betroffenen, all those who are affected. There is nothing about all affected interests. Mm-hmm. whether it is interest or in virtue of some other capacity that all affected are included. This requires some parsing out. But I mean, I think that Gooden is a very consistent thinker, and he took this horse and he rode it all the way. And but it's not the same thing. And as you see, he never really invokes discourse theory. And Nancy Fraser has been working on this. David Owen is working on this, and I have a special section in chapter 8 that I added about this discussion. So I'm going to stay away from the problems of that formulation, because partially it is lost in translation, but partially there are real conceptual issues about how to understand the all affected. Now, the second part of your question, in the work that in the rights of others, which was my work on citizenship and immigration, what I tried to do is basically differentiate, and we came back to this morning as well, between the requirements of practical discourses and democratic iterations and the question of the boundaries of the demos, right? Democratic iterations can also take place, and this was one of Richard's points, so thank you for bringing me back to this. Democratic iterations can also take place in trans-border, contexts, right? And the rights of migrants, but only the rights of migrants, and I wanted to mention this as well. Of course, the rights of migrants bear greatly on the rights of, domestic workers, and I think that this is one of the big issues in progressive politics, that the left has never had a really very good understanding of migration other than being defensive and threatened by it. I mean, I'm going to say that I think the German unions had much better policies than many others because they integrated migrant workers very quickly. But that's a contingent issue. But the reason why this is interesting is because the practical discourses of being all affected give us criteria of justice that are more demanding than the criteria of legitimacy or than the requirements of legitimacy. And so you have to engage in this mediation. Right? You have to engage in this, in this mediation. You cannot go from one level, to the other, because there is no positive right to citizenship, either in the international law or in other documents. But what they do write is a negative right, not to be denaturalized. But I mean, I say we can think of a right to citizenship, not of every person to belong every place else, but of a state to have an obligation to permit membership to those individuals under certain conditions, and then we'll have to, argue with each other about those conditions.
Good idea.
Well, it follows directly from this.
Can you talk a bit louder?
Sorry, it follows directly from this, these two questions, and it's more by way of clarifying, but reading The Rights of Others, which I think is a fantastic piece of work anyway, but it seems to me that there are different ways of reading who can do the claims making. When you look at the examples you give with the headscarf debates, you can get drawn into thinking that you have to have some sort of, if not full member state, then at least be a long-term resident. But some of your other formulations seems to allow for a more inclusive mediation where also asylum seekers or regular migrants could, in principle, enter into the public dialogue, even if they are not qualified to engage in the actual democratic decision-making, if you like. But it seems to me that in this book, would it be right to say that you take the more transnational, you push it in a more transnational direction, that the examples you give are the sort of other transnational social movements, that the sans-papiers in France were, definitely having a more murky status, legally speaking, than for example, the headscarf women and that debate.
Thank you for your kind words. It's I wondered about the distinction that you were seeing, there are different degrees of membership as well, but I think one of the big mistakes would be to confuse agency and or activism and membership. I just don't think that we know enough. I think that we may also have we may need to have some dialogue about also what is going on with these different kinds of organizations, civil society activism and various kinds of organizations. But by focusing on the transnational in the rights of others, in dignity and adversity, I did not mean, to privilege the one to the exclusion, of the other at all. I think that, of course, in these kinds of movements, be it around migrants' rights, be it around asylum and refugee issues, be it around women's issues, you have, and I know many of your generation. I think that this is all the kinds of politics that you're in. We're to some extent involved in. There really is a transnational conversation, or call it global. I don't know. I'm not really differentiating very carefully between these terms, though for some, this is very, very, very important. So I don't quite see the shift in focus that you are, picking up between the two works. But if you want to add something, maybe I'm getting a little tired. But go ahead, please.
Well, I guess it in a way goes back to the discussion of your work versus Bonnie Honig's earlier in the morning.
Yeah.
Because she sort of looks at irregular migrants and their sort of activism and talks about a sort of taking, that you're acting in advance of your categories or your legal categories, which you get from Lanchier, and you find it as well in Genesen's acts of citizenship conception that actually you are enacting a membership prior to acquiring that legal or political status. And I'm just wondering about what would be your views on that?
I'm completely in favor of it. I'm very sympathetic to it. I don't think that it will, necessarily resolve the questions of what we do about states when they enact regulations like requiring, £1,000 for certain suspect groups of Pakistani migrants who may want to read the British newspapers this morning. It's not going to answer the question of how we criticize, but I'm completely in this notion of enacting citizenship via practice and thus acquiring voice. There is absolutely no disagreement there.
Okay, we've got time, I think, for one or two quick questions and answers. Richard, do you want to say something?
Well, only if the space.
Okay.
It's on this last point about the acquisition of voice. There are groups of individuals globally, such as stateless people, for example, that are still, even in their human rights era, invisible, and no matter what they try to claim in terms of rights, still, it seems that until they get some sort of citizenship status, they remain invisible to both the communities where they live, where they struggle.
Of course, this is an insight that we all began with. We need to have more of an empirical hero sense of conditions of statelessness in the world today. And apart from the large numbers of, of course, Palestinian refugees, African refugees, and others, we need to have, an understanding that is different than Hannah Arendt's time, which began as a result of the collapse of the multicultural empires in Europe, basically, and the emergence of the nation-state system. But having said that, I don't so much disagree with you as I want to, forgive me for putting it this way, I want to de-dramatize this a little bit. It's dramatic enough. But what I mean by de-dramatizing it is that there is a certain kind of thinking about statelessness. I'm not sure that this is at all, anything that you would be sympathetic to, but take Giorgio Agamben. The stateless becomes a metaphor for everything that is considered wrong, not with the nation state, but also with the liberal democratic constitutional state. Well, de-dramatize. I mean, I just don't think that that is, correct. I don't think that, conceptually, we need to use the stateless as a continuous metaphor. There are ways about, there are other normative ways of thinking about. First of all, the practice simply should not happen in our world. And, and when the practice occurs in our world, there should be reprimands and measures against the countries that engage in it. I'm talking about denaturalizations, right? It used to happen in the 1960s as a result of self-determination, for example, of, post-colonial self-determination. This used to happen. It's, that kind of. Then, I mean, the bigger issue becomes the status of refugees, of course. And, should being a permanent refugee status, should it be acceptable? No. No, but how do we sort of enter into the conversation? I mean, as different from Hannah Arendt's time, when there were really neither any kind of, when there was no law or any kind of agency or any kind of even attention to this, in our world there is. And yet it's still interesting that, the practice goes on. And there seems to be, sort of, on the other hand, also this perpetual sense, well, you see, right? I mean, Guantanamo, secret renditions. This is the black, holes created by the CIA, by the U.S. government in complicity with the EU states. I mean, these are really moments in our, in our world that are also as delicate.
Right, I've got two, but as long as they're very quick, don't worry, there are other two sessions anyway. So, do you want to ask very quick questions, and then we'll see. You start first.
There is this dimension, I suppose, to the destabilization of state sovereignty, which seems to have a paradoxical character, because it's both an affirmation of sovereignty and an undermining of it, which is to do with the proliferation of claims to state status in the international arena, the fragmentation of sovereignty in the name of alternative sovereignty claims. And I just wondered whether you wanted to comment on that.
I'm interested in your two normative accounts of membership. So you seem to have the one idea, the more theoretical idea about just membership, and then there's democratic and legitimate principles of membership. So there would be the normative principle when discussed and parts of democratic iteration. So the principle of just membership would be the somewhat pure principle of you have a right to membership, not in a specific community, but you have a general right to membership. to take into account non-democratic reasons, and so it's a bit more the practical realization of the first normative principle. And then one could object to your principle of just membership, being the pure principle of membership, that already there you start from the assumption that those who live inside the demos now have a stronger claim to be citizens than those who are outside. So that's maybe the challenge as formulated by Sophia Nastrom, who says that if we question the legitimacy of the demos, we have to start much earlier. We have to ask, if we are on this level of argumentation, there are no boundaries, there are no borders, and no one has an initial claim to be part of a specific demo. So we're all on the same level, and those inside don't have a stronger claim to be citizens than those who are outside. So maybe your pure and first account of the just membership isn't strong enough in this sense.
You've got 1 minute, but you can always answer the questions in the next session.
I'll take more than 1 minute, sorry.
Okay.
People will just have to wait for a second. Can't throw these questions at me and then just... sovereignty. Part of it is what we understand under this concept, and the notion that's now being is very helpful is sovereignty regimes, because what we really are talking about is, the attributes of this, both politically and and legally, and I think that it's probably best to, it's a very understudied concept, but it is best to talk about sovereignty regimes. There is a very good recent book on it by Jean Cohen from Columbia University called Sovereignty, Legality, and Legitimacy, or Globalization and Sovereignty, where this concept is, very successfully parsed out. And, it always involves relations to others, although one thinks about this as if it was just, self-relational, because sovereignty basically means, you enter a terrain in a world, that is completely territorialized with, certain claims and privileges, right? But changing sovereignty regimes, no state now, has the use at bello. No state can declare, the right of war by itself except under certain conditions, etc. So that's, part of the work that needs to be done, because sovereignty is often identified with collective self-determination, which is part of popular sovereignty, but it's also mistakenly conflated with a bunch of territorial claims, which are very much dependent upon changing sovereignty regimes and international law. I know Sophia's article. It's a good logical argument, but it is counter intuitive. First of all, by just membership, I never mean pure membership. The only time that I know, it's very important for me, the only time that I use that concept at the beginning of the Rights of Others several times were, how could we reconstitute the conditions of membership such that the gap between legitimacy and justice would be somewhat ameliorated, never completely overlap. It just isn't possible. I am not willing to... So let me put it this way. Logically, if we go back to Robert Dahl's insight, at any t.0, the composition of the demos is a consequence of historical continuity, historical contingency, sometimes acquisition, sometimes exploitation, sometimes justification. I don't think that we need to worry about, a justice argument concerning that t.0. To me, that does not seem to be the sort of the puzzle. I'm willing to accept a certain amount of contingent relationship between peoples and territory. I'm not going to force that. A lot more could be said about it, but the chair will tell me it's enough, and my voice is drying up a little bit. I need to have something to drink for a bit, so
yes,
to be continued.
To be continued. There are 2 other sessions, and first of all, we would like to thank, of course, the speakers.